everybody, we are ready to go. Welcome back here to the Big Tent. Coolidge Cup competitors, judges, coaches, parents, special guests, friends of the Coolidge Foundation. Welcome to the 2022 Coolidge Cup Championship event. Day 3 of our epic venture into speech and debate, President Coolidge and the mandate of the United States Federal Reserve. My name is Jared Rhodes. I'm the director of the speech and debate program for the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Excited to bring you this very special set of events today. For those of you who haven't been with us the full week here, or in some sense like the past year, because really we start qualifying students for this event quite a long time ago. The Coolidge Cup is our end of school year national invitational tournament. We have 73 students here competing in debate, and we have 10 students here competing in Coolidge Declamation. So 83 students jointly from 22 different states, hundreds of rounds of debating being had with students debating both sides of a very difficult topic, and as we saw from the side stats that we have reported here and there, both sides can win. And on top of all the debate, dozens of Coolidge speeches being given, both in the prelims round and in front of these big crowds that we like to gather for what we call our showcases. All of the students who compete at this tournament had to qualify just to get here, as I kind of alluded to there, typically by doing very well at either one of our qualifier tournaments or some qualifier tournament that we kind of partner with, being a top placer in one of those tournaments or one of those methods that we use for qualification. This has already been a very memorable Coolidge Cup. A few years ago, I think it was to tag it would be the Coolidge Cup of Heat. Then we had the Coolidge Cup of Online. Last year we had the Coolidge Cup of Rain. Does anybody remember that? Mud, yeah. I don't want to give the bugs a shout out, so let's call this one the Coolidge Cup of Citronella. Okay, here we have 3 orders of business. First is to announce the 2022 Coolidge Cup winner in Declamation, and then to allow that student to come up here to the big stage to deliver the Coolidge Cup speech excerpt of his or her choice as a sort of victory speech, okay? Then the second thing we will do is hold the 2022 Coolidge Cup Championship round in debate, as set up behind me, as you can see. And then third, this third element will be done after about maybe a 20-minute intermission or so, in which we can encourage you to stick around and make friends and continue your great conversations. We will be breaking briefly and then coming back and doing our award ceremony, okay? So those are the 1, 2, 3s of this. Let's now recognize our Declamation winner. To recap, Declamation is a speech event, and at the Coolidge Cup, our speech competitors deliver the speeches of President Calvin Coolidge, no surprise. We've all been treated to some fine declamations by our competitors over the last few days. They've competed in the private, smaller rounds, the prelim rounds in front of relatively small judge panels and each other. And then they've also competed in front of the big audiences here in the Big Tent, here also in the church, in the village. I think I speak for a lot of us who have really been moved and inspired by hearing those speeches. Hearing Coolidge's words from a long time ago, interpreted by our very young and modern declaimers. And I've been certainly impressed by how they've done, and also how well those words have stood up over time. At this moment, our 10 Declamation students, along with all the rest of us, are waiting to hear who the winner is for that event, and so I won't delay the suspense any longer. Okay, so the student whose name I will call, after which we can give a hearty round of applause, is going to come up here for a victory lap speech, which will be a Coolidge speech excerpt of their choice. This is not scored. The scoring has already happened. This is the winner. So ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the winner of the 2022 Coolidge Cup Declamation event, Mary Sanapoo.
It's an honor and privilege to be here today. It's simply the grace of God that I'm here. Literally, I don't know, I saw a flyer on a table and I applied. And I'm here in a state I knew nothing about, talking about a president I knew nothing about. And I've come to grow and admire so much the state of Vermont, and more than that, the life of President Coolidge. I always respected and admired George Washington from my childhood, but Calvin Coolidge demonstrates so much of what Washington did and more. One thing that I love that he said, it's in the plaque in the church, it talks about Vermont. How much he loves Vermont, this beautiful place that we've all had the privilege to experience, whether you live here or whether you're from somewhere else. And what he says is how much it means to him. To think that he would leave the White House, leave the presidency, and come back here, what would make him do that? It was his home. It was where he belongs. And I think that wherever we are, we can be instilled by President Calvin Coolidge that that is our home, and that is where we belong. And more than that, America is our home. And what America is founded on is beyond what any other country is. He often talks about that. It's just a beautiful land. And it is an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little overwhelmed. When we go back home today, I hope that we can all remember and realize that each of us have a home. And it is our ability to defend it, to support it, and to fight for it, as he said in the speech I'm about to declaim. It's up to us. It's not an act of government. It is the spirit of the people themselves. It is the spirit here, manifested in all of you. That is the spirit of this speech. And it's not just a speech. It's in all of us. And I encourage us, wherever we go home today, that we take it home to our schools, to our workplaces, to our churches, to our townhouses, to stand up for what we believe in. The destiny of America was delivered on May 30, 1923, by President Calvin Coolidge. This was in honor of Memorial Day in Northampton, Massachusetts. And this speech, he identifies that fundamental spirit of patriotism. He then talks about how the spirit is to be maintained and fostered today, and then how it is to be used to further accomplish America's destiny. And then he acknowledges that while those who paid the ultimate price in order to recognize that spirit are no longer with us, it's still very much alive, but it is up to us to carry the torch. Patriotism is easy to understand in America. It means looking out for yourself by looking out for your country. Lincoln stated the substance of the whole matter in his famous phrase, quote, "Government of the people, by the people, and for the people," end quote. A definition of the relationship between the institutions of our government and the American people entirely justifies the assertion that all things were made by them, and without them was not anything made that was made. It is because the American government is the sole creation and possession of the people that they have always cherished it and defended it, and always will. If we perceive a destiny in America, if we believe that providence has been the guide, our own success, our own salvation require that we should act and serve in harmony and obedience. Just at a time when Christianity was at last established, when there was a general advance in learning, when there was a great spiritual awakening, America began to be revealed to the European world. Settlers came here from mixed motives. They were an inspired body of men. They had a genius for organized government on the foundation of society, righteousness, liberty, piety, and obedience to law. They let slip their grasp upon conventionalities that they may lay firmer hold upon realities. The characteristics of those principles of government from which all others are deduced is a government of limited and defined powers, leaving the people supreme. The executive has the sole command of the military forces, but he cannot raise $1 of revenue. The legislature has the sole authority to levy taxes, but it cannot issue a command to a single private soldier. And the judiciary interprets and defends the law and the Constitution, but it can neither create nor destroy the right of a single individual. Freedom of action is complete within moral bounds which the people themselves have prescribed. Such is America. Such is the government and civilization which have grown up around the church, the town meeting, and the schoolhouse. Who can fail to see in it the hand of destiny? Who can doubt that it has been guided by divine providence? From the day of the Puritan and the Cavalier, we have seen how it works among us. Who can dare to challenge it? Who can dare to challenge it into action? But if a republic is to be maintained and improved, it'll be through the efforts and character of the individual. It'll be, first of all, because of the efforts which exist in the home, because of the ideals which prevail in the home life which make up the strength of the nation. The viciousness of waste and the value of thrift must continue to be learned and understood. Civilization rests on conservation. To these must be added religion, education, and obedience to law. These are the foundation of all character in the individual and all hope in the nation. Our country does not want war. It wants peace. It does not decree this memorial season as an honor to war. It is to the spirit of those men, exhibited in all our wars, to the spirit that places the devotion to freedom and truth above the devotion to life, that the nation pays its ever-enduring mark of reverence and respect. Quote, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Unquote. This spirit is not dead. It is the most vital thing in America. It did not flow from any act of government. It is the spirit of the people themselves, remembering all that it has accomplished from the day of the Puritan and Cavalier to the day of the last least immigrant who believes in it no less than they. Who shall dare to doubt it? Who shall dare to challenge it? Who shall venture to rouse it into action? Calm, peaceful, puissant it remains, conscious of its authority, slow to anger, plenteous in mercy, seeking not to injure but to serve, the safeguard of the republic, still the guarantee of a broader freedom, the supreme moral power in the world. It is in this spirit that we place our trust. It is to the spirit, with this returning year, we pledge all that we have and are. Thank you. I would like to mention that each and every one of you have done an amazing job, and I've had the opportunity to meet so many wonderful and amazing declaimers. They were all amazing, and I believe they all deserve a round of applause. Can we have a round of applause? And I also want to thank the most important part of this whole event, Mr. Tracy Messer, who acted as President Calvin Coolidge and helped me to realize who Coolidge was, and for the first time, really appreciate Mr. Coolidge. And he literally made this the most important part. Thank you.
Okay, well done. Next we will have our championship round of debate. So here we go. Audience, are you ready? Okay. The topic for the 2022 Coolidge Cup tournament pertains to an enormously important issue that's so often hidden from view, but it is actually quite important. It's monetary policy. Monetary policy as in the policies and goals pursued by the United States Federal Reserve. The status quo, of course, as many of you know and have been debating all week, is that we have a dual mandate of managing inflation and employment. And the question is that we ask here, in effect, is should we continue with that dual mandate, or should we revert to a more historical mandate of a single mandate of just managing inflation? The resolution for this tournament, which we announced about a month ago or so, and in which all of our debaters have had to debate both sides multiple times over the course of this tournament, is a challenging one. It's not an easy resolution by any stretch. That resolution is resolved. The mandate of the Federal Reserve should be amended to pursue price stability only, rather than to pursue price stability and full employment. So we've certainly enjoyed hearing you debate it, and we hope that you have enjoyed debating it yourselves. Our final two debaters, having been narrowed down from from an initial field of 73, are Danielle Miller. Yeah, welcome. And Patrick McDonald. Okay, our championship round judge panel is composed of 9 esteemed members of our community and friends of the Coolidge Foundation. I will briefly introduce each and then we'll begin. First, Mr. Bob Luddy, founder and CEO, Captive Air Systems and Coolidge Foundation trustee. Let's give you a round of applause. Dr. Ben Voth, Coolidge Debate Fellow, Director and Director of Debate and Speech at Southern Methodist University. Jane Hemingway, Coolidge Foundation trustee and now retired following a 30-year career as a special agent for the FBI. Brooke Selassie, consultant and expert in corporate strategy based in Virginia. Jennifer Coolidge Harville, Coolidge Foundation trustee and great-granddaughter of President Coolidge and Grace Coolidge. Catherine Sylvester, class of 2018 Coolidge Scholar. Rejoice Sherry, Site Administrator for the President Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site. Matthew Tweeden, 1890 Society member and 2020 Coolidge Cup champion in debate. And lastly, myself, Jared Rhodes. As you know, I'm the debate director here, and I also research and teach health policy over at Dartmouth. This round will last about 40 minutes. If you're new to high school debate, I do want to alert you that there are likely to be a few points during the debate here when the debaters might ask for prep time. 60 seconds here, 30 seconds here. They each have 5 minutes to spend. Okay. During any prep time that is taken, I'd like to ask everybody to remain quiet in the tent. Okay. And with that, I will now turn it over to our debaters.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick McDonald. I will be the affirmative speaker. The judges are all set. Then we can begin. Quote, "The chief business of the American people is business. They are profoundly concerned with producing, buying, selling, investing, and prospering in the world," end quote. Calvin Coolidge correctly identified that the chief concern for Americans is and always has been prosperity. However, as evidenced by his presidency, he also believed that the government's job is not to aim for that goal itself, but rather to create conditions that are conducive to our pursuit of that goal. It's because I agree with that philosophy that I stand resolved. The mandate of the Federal Reserve should be amended to pursue price stability only, rather than to pursue price stability and full employment. I'd like to begin by making one thing very clear. I am not here to advocate against full employment. Rather, I'm here to say that the Federal Reserve cannot achieve it directly, but only indirectly by maintaining a stable currency. We'll see this in two arguments, the first of which can be written down as contention one. Predictability maximizes prosperity. Economists love to ask, what causes unemployment? But that's backwards. Unemployment doesn't have a cause, it is the natural state of human beings. A better question is, what causes employment? Okun's law states that increases in employment are caused by economic growth. The more economic activity that occurs, the more labor is needed to sustain that activity. As explained by Professor of Economics Dr. Lee Tesfatchen, this relationship is, quote, a well-established and empirical fact, end quote. The question faced by policymakers is not explicitly how do we stop unemployment, but rather how do we best allow for economic expansion? As explained by Dr. William Poole and Dr. David Wheelock, economic activity is best fostered by creating stable and predictable conditions. The more information people have about the future, the more efficiently they will spend their money. The more efficiently they spend their money, the faster the economy grows, because the more readily supply equals demand, and therefore, the more people get employed. This is why price stability is so important. In order to make profitable investments, companies need to know how much the dollar will be worth in the future. If they don't, they won't be able to spend their money efficiently because they'll be operating on faulty or entirely faulty information. As explained by Dr. Alexander Salter, if they don't know the value of the dollar, they either won't invest at all, which limits growth, or will make malinvestments based on faulty price signals, which wastes their capital and eventually causes a recession. Every Fed chairperson in the last 43 years has affirmed this simple connection. Predictability leads to efficient spending leads to sustainable growth, and sustainable growth leads to employment. An example of this is the 1920s. In 1920, inflation was raging. To fix this, the Fed tightened the money supply and killed the inflation. What followed was a recession that lasted about 6 months. But today, it's called the Forgotten Depression, because once the inflation flattened, the economy immediately rebounded. What came next was a decade of unsurpassed economic prosperity. In the 1970s, we were likewise facing stagflation, where both inflation and unemployment were high. The Fed raised interest rates in 1980, and again, this caused a recession. But again, within just 4 years, inflation had dropped over 600%, from 14.6 to 2.4, and employment had completely recovered. As such, in the 80s and 90s, stagflation went away, and the economy boomed. Dr. John Taylor, an economist at Stanford, puts it best, quote, "A focus on only one mandate, price stability, would inadvertently achieve the goals of both," end quote. Contention 2. Separating price stability from employment is distracting and unnecessary. Again, separating price stability from employment is distracting and unnecessary. This is true for one very simple reason. The Federal Reserve is incapable of achieving economic growth or sustainable employment through any other means than price stability. And if they were to try, they'd only make things worse. In fact, though the Fed was given a mandate to achieve full employment in 1978, it never once even mentioned it until 30 years later. This was for good reason. The Fed itself cannot create real growth. All they can do is increase the money supply. And those aren't the same thing. Increasing the numerical value of the currency doesn't stimulate economic advancement. That's why Zimbabwe's economy is terrible, even though they have trillions upon trillions of Zimbabwean dollars. When the Fed pumps money into the economy, it doesn't increase the value of the goods or services, and it doesn't make them any easier to produce. True demand only increases when goods and services themselves get more valuable, or when it's easier to make more of them. The Fed can't affect either of those factors at all. All pumping money into the economy does in the long run is decrease the purchasing power of the currency. That's why, when the CME Group published a study in 2018 examining the Fed's quantitative easing, they found it, quote, had no actual impact on growth, end quote. Real growth is stimulated by hard work, determination, ingenuity, and good fiscal policy, not a printer. The Federal Reserve is powerful but blunt. As such, we shouldn't expect too much of it. And when we do, the economy is harmed. Thank you.
Okay. Excuse me. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. I have 2 minutes on my timer. If you were the Fed and you could press a button today to skyrocket interest rates to bring inflation all the way down to 2%, would you do it?
If I could push a button, raise interest rates to bring inflation down to 2%, would I do it? Absolutely, 100%.
Okay, you do that today. Press a
Yeah,
button
and
right
in fact,
now.
the Fed did exactly that in 1920. It caused a recession, lasted about 6 months, then the 20s boomed. I would do that again in a heartbeat.
Oh, okay. Did the Fed do that in one day?
Yeah, they raised it 1.5% in one day to 7% in 1920.
All right, and did that bring it down? What did it bring it down from to get to 2%?
Inflation was at 18%. It steadied. I believe it went down to 5 initially after that. I'm not sure if it went all the way down to 2 eventually, but the point was they brought it down 3 times further. But just for right now, inflation's at 8.6%, so the same change would get it down to 2 and then some.
Shouldn't employment be a factor in our decision making at all?
Should unemployment be a factor in decision making?
In the Fed's decision making?
Yes. So my contention is pretty simple, that price stability leads to maximum employment in the long run. So the reason we value price stability is because we value economic growth. So it's implicitly a factor.
All right. Is there any time when we compromise between price stability and unemployment?
We never compromise between sustainable employment and price stability. You can have unsustainable employment in response to price stability, but I don't think that's ever a good trade-off.
You talked about how the Fed didn't mention the unemployment mandate for 30 years. Do you think this was a priority in their decision making?
They effectively operated, according to economist Daniel Thornton of the St. Louis Fed, under a single mandate between 1978 and 2008. They never mentioned employment, not once, in any policy statement.
Which do you think the Fed prioritizes more today, inflation or employment?
Right now, I think they prioritize them both somewhat equally. So I'll give you an example. Jay Powell raised interest rates 0.25% and then 0.75% in March and then May, respectively. If he was really serious about the inflation, he would raise it probably at least another percent, but he hasn't done so.
Thank you. This will be a 5-minute speech. Everyone's ready? Calvin Coolidge once said, quote, "Industry cannot flourish if labor languish. The general welfare cannot be provided for in any one act, but it is well to remember that the benefit of one is the benefit of all, and the neglect of one is the neglect of all," end quote. I like to go back into cross-examination, where Patrick talked about how he would press that button today to skyrocket interest rates to bring inflation all the way down to 2%. The sacrifice that causes for the amount of unemployment that we would see is unnecessary, and it's not taking into account the benefit of all. Industry and production and long-term employment and long-term general welfare of the economy cannot flourish if labor languish. And that's going to be the point that I'm making today. First off, before I get into my points, in response to Patrick's first speech, first off, he talked about how predictability maximizes prosperity. I agree to this as a general principle. Usually this is how it works. And in fact, that's why the Fed has prioritized inflation so much higher than they prioritize getting rid of unemployment. However, in some cases, for example, in very extreme economic recessions, we need to be able to look at the employment as well. So where we disagree fundamentally is that the Fed has equal goals of prioritizing inflation and employment. And that's what Patrick said in the last cross-examination, and that's what I'm going to be contesting right now. You can write down my response as dual mandate prioritizes inflation, but still considers employment. That's dual mandate prioritizes inflation, but still considers employment. Alice Rivlin, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve and senior economic fellow at the Brookings Institute, spoke to the House Financial Services Committee in 2012 about why the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve is worth keeping. Her reasoning was not that employment was at an equal or even higher concern for the Fed than inflation. In fact, it was the opposite. Like Patrick said, she said, quote, exclusive attention to inflation served central banks well in the last century, end quote. But that didn't change her mind about wanting to keep the dual mandate. She said, quote, the dual mandate is not inconsistent with a strong emphasis on controlling inflation when appropriate, or even with an explicit target for inflation, end quote. Just like Alice Rivlin, I agree that price stability should be the main focus of the Fed. And it is. But changing to a single mandate would make that the Fed's only concern, that unemployment should not even be a factor in their decisions. As Rivlin put it, quote, to change the language of the law to imply that the Fed's only concern should be inflation would send a misleading signal to a public rightly concerned with jobs and growth as well as inflation, end quote. What we're choosing between today is, first off, the world under the dual mandate, where we have the Fed highly prioritizing inflation and price stability far above unemployment, as according to Alice Rivlin. Or we have the world of the single mandate, where the Fed's only concern is inflation, and they don't care about jobs and growth and whatever comes after. Here's why this is a problem. Now, usually, focusing on price stability will lead to growth in the economy, so it's okay. But in extreme circumstances, we need to be able to step in and take a check on the crazy actions of the Fed, like skyrocketing interest rates, pressing a button, and getting inflation down to 2% tomorrow. Why is that a bad idea? You can write down my example as the single mandate led to a depression within a depression. Thus, a single mandate led to a depression within the depression. Before we had the dual mandate, we see in May of 1937, during the Great Depression, inflation was at 5.1%. So the Fed looked at that, thought it was a bad idea, and withdrew money from the system by raising the reserve requirement. As explained by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, this caused the quote, depression within the depression, one of the worst setbacks our country has ever seen. Production fell 32%. 1 in 5 people were unemployed. The Fed's narrow focus had destroyed the economy. This is the types of steps that the Fed would take under a single mandate. And these are the types of steps that cause unnecessary pain to the economy that is going to have long-term effects. If we have extremely deep recessions, that's going to have a permanent impact and create permanent scars on the economy. There are times, for example, during the Great Depression, when we need to have some other factor in the Fed's decision-making. Usually, price stability leads to better employment, but we need to have the flexibility to allow the Fed to take employment into account when needed. I'd like again to talk about pressing that button and why I wouldn't do it. Because if I pressed that button today, it would create long-term growth in the economy, but it would do it in an unnecessary way. How the second mandate keeps the Fed in check is that it stops them from doing something like that. The Fed can still increase interest rates. They can still target inflation as their primary goal. But having to consider employment as well makes them do that slower, makes them do that in the way that is more effective to preserving both goals. Thank you.
Two minutes?
Yep,
Okay. If the judges are ready, and am I on?
already.
Okay. In 1920, the Fed raised interest rates 1.5% in a day, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and that killed the inflation, right?
I'm not sure if it killed the inflation in the day.
Okay, doesn't the Coolidge brief say it killed the inflation over time?
Over time, yeah.
Okay, and the 1920s boomed because of that, right?
I mean, there were a lot of different factors in place.
Okay, so we
but
should do that
was a
again.
factor.
So we should do that again, right?
No. It depends on the situation. So when we look at these applications, there's so many other factors that are in place that we can't fully explore in the length of this round.
How else
But-
do you kill inflation than by taking money out of the economy?
Oh, that's how you do it. But
Okay.
you do it slower by taking employment into account. We don't have to do it in a day. We can do it slower, and the only reason we would do it slower is if we were taking unemployment into account into our decision making.
Okay, why does doing it slower make it any better?
Because then the economy doesn't have to react as quickly. So the economy likes things to be predictable. It likes to be able to take smaller steps if we do something right away.
Okay.
It changes the economy very rapidly.
You cited the
That's-
depression within the depression, and you cited Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, right?
Yes.
That was a study from 1963, right?
I'm not sure.
Okay, let's say it was from 1963. Would evidence from 2015 or 2020 probably be better?
It was 1963. Well, it was talking about a historical example, so
Right, but we know more about what happened during that time now than we did then, right?
I don't see why we would.
Okay, I'll address that in my next speech. For now, you said that the Fed prioritizes inflation over employment. Did you quote the Fed a single time?
I quoted the former vice chair of the Fed.
Right, but she wasn't in the Fed at that point, right?
Not at that point, but she was explaining how the Fed works.
Okay, and the Fed isn't raising interest rates to kill the 8.6% inflation in any quick period of time right now, are they?
They're not pressing the button.
Okay, so they're only taking very small incremental steps, and inflation is still at 8.6%, right?
Right, I'm not totally defending all of the Fed's actions. I'm just saying that they should have a dual mandate and they should be considering unemployment.
Got it. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Interrupting timer. Three minutes. You're all set. The judges are all set, and we can begin. Quote, industry cannot flourish if labor languish, end quote. This was how my opponent began her last speech. I want to swap out two of those words. Quote, labor cannot flourish if industry languish. This isn't exactly what Calvin Coolidge said, but it is exactly as true. If we don't have industry, if we don't have economic growth, if we don't have economic activity, we're not going to have sustainable employment. The only way to get to sustainable employment, the only way to make sure that people are actually productively employed, is to increase economic growth, increase economic activity, and that will lead to prosperity in the long run. That's an economic law. It's called Okun's law. It's a well-established and empirical fact. My opponent has not contested it. And two main contentions in this speech. First, that more dollars doesn't mean more jobs. I want to turn to Eric Norland, executive director and senior economist at the CME Group. He writes in 2018, quote, using nearly a decade of evidence, we look at what the impact quantitative easing had in the US, the UK, Eurozone, and Japan. It had no actual impact on growth, end quote. Dr. Kjell Hausken and Dr. Mthuli Q authored a book in 2014. They looked at that same group of countries and they found, quote, no significant effect on quantitative easing on GDP, end quote. This is very important because since 2008, the Fed has been performing quantitative easing, pumping money into the economy to try to create sustainable economic growth. It hasn't worked. The only thing it's led to is inflation. Because simply having more numerical dollars doesn't lead to economic growth in the long run, it just depreciates the purchasing power of the dollar. Now, my opponent says we have to have a holistic approach. We have to consider both inflation and price stability, or price stability and employment. It's my contention that those are the same thing. That the only way to get to employment is to have economic growth. The only way to have economic growth is to have predictable conditions so that economic actors have information about the future. If they don't have that future, they're not going to spend their money efficiently. My opponent brings up the example of the depression within the depressions. He says when the Federal Reserve raised the reserve requirement, that actually contracted money from the system and caused industrial production to fall. That's not true. Professor of economics Patrick Van Horn writes in 2014, quote, our analysis shows that member banks did not contract bank lending in response to the increase in reserve requirements. The lending behavior of member banks did not differ from the non-member banks. Member banks were able to mitigate the contractionary effects of the Fed's reserve requirements by selling securities, end quote. Now that's a complex piece of evidence. I want to explain what it means. My opponent brings up how the Fed increased the reserve requirement for banks, meaning how much money they have to keep in their vaults. However, as this evidence establishes, that didn't change how much money they were lending into the actual economy, meaning the money supply was the same before and after. The Fed's action didn't itself cause any problems. Second point, sustainable employment is only created by predictability. Anytime the Federal Reserve trades off some sort of predictability and price stability for some sort of temporary employment or an attempt at temporary employment, all they're going to do is decrease the amount of information that economic actors have about the future. Companies and businesses and investors and banks need to know how much money the dollar will be worth in the future, otherwise they won't spend their money efficiently. Either they'll hoard it or they'll invest it and they'll make malinvestments based on faulty price signals. For these reasons, I urge you to affirm the resolution. Thank you.
And I'll be taking this in my 1 minute and 19 seconds of prep time.
This will be a 3-minute speech. There is one thing that my opponent and I agree on, and a couple of things we disagree on. The first and most important one that we agree on is that in the long term, and fundamentally and usually, price stability leads to better employment. And that's why I'm defending the status quo of the Federal Reserve prioritizing price stability so high above unemployment. So that's where we agree. There's a couple places we disagree. 3 that I'm going to be highlighting in this speech. First place we disagree. In his last speech, my opponent talked about how more dollars does not equal more jobs.
I disagree. In the short term, it does, because it stimulates the economy in the short term and means that if people feel richer, then they buy more things, more production. We have to hire more people to increase that production. It does lead to unemployment. It does lead to more employment in the short term. Now, it doesn't lead to sustainable jobs, and it doesn't lead to better jobs, and it doesn't lead to more jobs in the long term. It is in the short term. And why is that important? Because there are some cases where we need to rescue the economy from a deep depression in the short term. And there are some times when we need to put a check on the Federal Reserve to not destroy the economy in the short term for those long-term benefits. If we're already in the Great Depression, we don't need to increase the amount of pressure that we're putting on the economy. We need to be thinking about the short term, not about the long term in an emergency situation. My second thing that I disagree on is that the Fed prioritizes stability. This is my position that my opponent has disagreed on, that the Fed prioritizes stability. And this is actually what we can see from history and from the results of the Fed's actions. The only true way we can gauge their goal is how it has come about. PhD Eric Rosengard authored a study in 2014 finding that, quote, the US has yielded no worse outcomes on inflation than countries with a single mandate. It actually performs better, end quote. The Congressional Research Service expounds that, quote, inflation has been consistently low and stable. The Fed's record on price stability could not have been improved, end quote. This is a sign of just how much the Fed is prioritizing inflation and price stability above unemployment now. They just need that unemployment to keep their actions in check and to make sure that they're not making unnecessary sacrifices. Which leads to my final response, the depression within the depression. His last speech, he talked about how there were some factors that meant that the depression within the depression wasn't necessarily caused by the Fed's actions in that circumstance. But we can look at the results. We can look at how inflation was at 5.1%, and we can look at the philosophy of the Fed in this situation. When they had that single mandate, and all they cared about was inflation. Raising those interest rates to get rid of that inflation resulted, or at least the next outcome that we saw, was that the highest unemployment rate that our country has ever seen. There's a lot of factors in every example that we bring up, and they're not going to win the debate round just on their own. But we can see, and the general principle, is that when we are in an emergency situation, and when unemployment is already low, the Fed needs to have the flexibility to act correctly. Thank you.
4 minutes? You're all set? Okay. And the judges? Then we can begin. I'd like you to ask yourself, thinking back through the debate, about one example or one time where my opponent has established that the Federal Reserve can directly create employment. Any evidence, any examples of them actually pumping money into the economy and that actually leading to an increase in jobs? We haven't seen it thus far. She's had multiple opportunities to do so. We haven't seen a single example. So in that light, what is the justification for the Federal Reserve having a dual mandate to independently pursue employment? Not just to safeguard employment, but to actively pursue it. I don't think there's been an example, and I don't think there's been a justification. I want to address on 2 points my opponent made in her last speech and then make 2 voting issues. Firstly, in regards to the Great Depression, she says that the Federal Reserve contracting and restricting the money supply caused the recession within the recession. I pointed out in my last speech, the Federal Reserve didn't actually contract or restrict the money supply. The member banks of the Federal Reserve, which theoretically had a bigger reserve requirement than they did before, continued lending out the same amount of money. What does that mean? It delinks all Fed policy from the depression my opponent is citing, because the Fed policy didn't actually change any real economic factors. They didn't raise interest rates, they just raised the reserve requirement, but that didn't decrease the amount of money that member banks at the Federal Reserve were lending out into the economy. That means that the cause of the recession, the depression within the depression, wasn't Fed policy, it wasn't looking towards price stability. I would maintain the Fed should have looked towards price stability in that case. It would have allowed the economy to come out of the recession quicker. Nextly, looking to the idea of the Fed policy and how they really don't prioritize employment too much, she cited a couple pieces of evidence on this. I'd like to point out that I generally agree. Between 1978 and 2008, the Federal Reserve did not really prioritize employment. In fact, they didn't mention it. That's why those years were such economic booms in this country. But since 2008, as I cited, they have continued to focus on the employment part of the mandate. They've conducted 4 rounds of quantitative easing. I'd like to point to a couple of numbers. Before the COVID pandemic in 2020, the M2 money supply of the United States was $16 trillion. Right now, it's $21 trillion. The Federal Reserve increased it by 30%, essentially. Yet my opponent is trying to say, no, all they care about is price stability. That's all they're looking towards. Obviously not. They increased the money supply by 30%. That's not going to keep the prices stable. And we see that now. Right now, inflation is at 8.6%, a 40-year high. There is a remarkable difference between the Fed under the dual mandate and the Fed interpreting it as a single mandate. And the single mandate economy was markedly better. This brings me to my first voting issue, that of predictability. With a single mandate, we will have predictability because we will have slow and steady rates of inflation, 2% basically speaking, on an annual basis. What does that mean? It means that economic actors, companies, businesses, investors, and banks will know how much money the dollar will be worth in the future. As such, instead of simply hoarding their money and not investing it, they will try to invest it. And when they do invest it, when they do create more projects in the long term, as my opponent has conceded, they're going to create actual economic growth. And as I've established in this debate, Okun's law, a well-established and empirical fact, says that when you have economic growth, when you have more sustainable economic activity, you have more employment. The only thing the Federal Reserve could do in the short term is to try to increase the money supply to trick people into thinking they have more money than they do, which increases employment in the short term, but ends up in having a recession because all of that demand crashes all the way back down when the prices go up. And this brings me to the second voting issue, that of volatility. I want to point to the 2008 recession one more time, where the Fed conducted 3 rounds of quantitative easing. I've read 3 different studies into this debate, conducted with regards to a decade of evidence across Japan, the UK, the USA, and the Eurozone, all finding that quantitative easing had no actual impact on growth, but that it did increase inflation. The Fed is making that trade-off. They're making the trade-off between unsustainable employment or the pursuit of unsustainable employment, and they're sacrificing price stability. With a single mandate, they wouldn't do that. Thus, I urge an affirmation.
And I'll be taking my remaining 16 seconds of prep time.
Four-minute speech. Calvin Coolidge once said, quote, "Do the day's work. If it be to protect the rights of the weak, do it. If it be to help a powerful corporation better serve the people, do that. Don't hesitate to be as reactionary as the multiplication table," end quote. The point Coolidge is making here is that our government needs to be flexible. If there's anything this resolution has taught me, it's that economics is very complicated, and it's not stable even when we're just pursuing price stability. Wars and pandemics happen, and the economy gets really messed up. And in these emergency situations, when the economy isn't operating like it usually does, we need to be able to react in a way that mitigates that damage. Today, I'm not going to be responding to everything that was brought up in this round. There was a lot. I'm just going to be talking about 3 things that I think should sway your ballot at the end of the day. My first one, you can write down as contrasting goals keep each other in check. That's contrasting goals keep each other in check. Now, I don't necessarily have to advocate for everything the Fed is doing. I think some of it is honestly a little bit overboard. But I do have to advocate that the dual mandate should be in place and that we should have price stability as a factor in the Fed's decision making. That is where me and my opponent disagree on whether or not unemployment should be a factor that holds back the Fed from taking drastic action. For example, pushing that button. In his last speech, my opponent talked about how the Fed needs to actually pursue unemployment, not just use it as a factor to keep others in check. My response to this is that's not how the Fed actually works. If we look at how the Fed actually works, according to Alice Rivlin, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, she explained that, quote, "The dual mandate is not inconsistent with a strong emphasis on controlling inflation when appropriate or even with an explicit target for inflation," end quote. The dual mandate prioritizes inflation far above it prioritizes employment. But to change that language, she said, quote, "To change the language of the law to imply that the Fed's only concern should be inflation would send a misleading signal to a public rightly concerned about jobs and growth," end quote. Again, like to draw you back to that term, only concern. The question we're asked today is whether or not unemployment should be a concern at all for the Fed. And that's what I'm defending. You can write down my second voting issue as the Fed pursues only price stability under the one mandate. That's the Fed pursues only price stability under the single mandate. This is the point that I was just making from Alice Rivlin. If we only have one mandate, we cannot keep the interest rates and the actions of the Fed in check. There are some situations where it is too extreme to continue to pursue inflation when we are in the middle of employment, when we are in the middle of deep unemployment. When we're in the middle of a deep depression, we need to be able to boost that. In his last speech, my opponent talked about how there's no example of money creating employment. And I agree, in the long term, there's no example of money creating stable employment. However, we would have a lot more unemployment if we increased the interest rates tomorrow to get inflation down, because there would be less money in the economy. People would immediately feel poorer. The economy would be really messy and be changing very quickly. People would have less confidence. They would spend less. If people spend less, that harms the economy as a whole, and it means that we have less employment. So there is a way that having this dual mandate keeps employment higher than it would be if we didn't have that dual mandate. Allowing it to keep the Fed's actions in check allows the Fed to not increase unemployment to a ridiculous degree. Which brings me to my final voting issue, which is unemployment creates deep unemployment creates long-term scars. That's deep unemployment creates long-term scars. We shouldn't, when we're looking at the short term of unemployment, we're also looking at the long term. Because when we look at how deep the Great Depression got and how deep the crises that we see today can get, we can see that deep unemployment will create long-term scars on the economy. My question for you is, would you press that button? And if your answer is no, vote nay.
Well done, debaters. We will now take our intermission. Judges, we can head inside. We won't be conferring, but we'll be collecting the ballots once everybody has written them, and then we'll be back here to announce and do awards. Thank you. All right, come on into the tent. We are back. Thank you again for being here. Before we proceed with the award ceremony, I'd just like to express some more gratitude for the many people who have come together to make this tournament possible. First, I'd like to give thanks to the many parents and debate coaches and others who have helped so many bright students get here, both through the qualifying process and getting to those tournaments, and then getting here to this tournament as well. So let's have a round of applause for all of them. First, I'd like to have a hearty thank you for all of our volunteer citizen judges. Without you, we cannot do this. I'd like to thank all the Coolidge Scholars for their skillful and versatile service in so many things, including getting the tents and tables set up and judging, and assisting with the various ceremonies even, and helping in myriad other ways. So thank you. I love the continuity of the program. I'd like especially to thank the members of the 1890 Society who are here. They're utterly indispensable, and in addition to providing some expert judging here and there, they also helped me to run this tournament fairly and accurately and very efficiently, so thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Vermont Department of Historic Preservation for opening up their historic site for us all and sharing their spaces and their lawn and the barns and their grounds year after year. So thank you to them. Special thanks to all my close colleagues at the Coolidge Foundation: Joe Coleman, Tiana Luo, Nathaniel Cameron, Sam Williams, William Pettigrew. Oh yeah, let's single clap it. Yeah, I'm gonna start again to single clap that. That's good. All right, Joe Coleman, Tiana Luo, Nathaniel Cameron, Sam Williams, William Pettigrew, Tracy Messer, Colleen Stamos, Rob Hammer, Dr. Ben Vogt, Matt Denhart, Amy Schley. Matt Denhart's not with us. He's out. He's helping us remotely this year. And I'd like to thank all of our board members and trustees, in particular Coolidge trustee and main sponsor of this event, Mr. Bob Luddy. Would you like to come up to the stage and say a few words?
We're running late, but just a couple of quick comments. So first, thank you for being here. This is probably the most impressive group of students I've ever been encountering. So you have a tremendous head start in life. You're going to be very well accomplished, and you've learned from Calvin Coolidge. When you listen to the declaimers and the speeches he wrote, they're beyond impressive. He's got a tremendous command of the language, and even though they call him Silent Cal, he had a tremendous influence on the world, and in my opinion, he was the president who followed what the founders expected perfectly. And for doing that, he didn't get any trophies, and he didn't get any recognition in history. But I think all of you today have witnessed what an important president he was, and I hope you will continue to learn from him. So my theme is seek the truth, learn from the masters, continue to grow throughout your entire lifetime, and we are very proud of each and every one of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, on to this year's prizes for declamation and debate. For this part of the program, I'd like to invite up Coolidge Debate Fellow Dr. Ben Voth, help up to the stage here to help with trophies. Declamation. So for the second time at the Coolidge Cup, we've had declamation as its own bona fide event, and it did not disappoint. We started with 10 declamation students, and through a long process of accumulating points over many speeches, we can now announce the top 4 who will receive a Coolidge Cup declamation trophy. Top 4 students who accumulated points not just through their prelim rounds, but also the showcase speeches. And I want to mention that all the showcase speeches were judged by a static panel of 5 secret judges, static so as to control for variation there. Please join me in thanking Tiana Lowe, Josh Herring, Robert Kirkendall, Jennifer Herring, and Brooke Selassie. They composed our So we'll just call up our top 4 here, but all of our declamation students will receive a Coolidge Cup leather notebook afterwards. In 4th place, receiving a prize of $250 and a trophy, Angel Aquino. Come on up. Yeah, we'll do it. In 3rd place, receiving a prize of $500 and a trophy, Evangeline Martin. In 2nd place, receiving a prize of $750 and a trophy, Nathaniel Kolsak. Congratulations. And as you know, in 1st place in receiving a prize of $1,000 and a trophy, Mary Sanapu. Excellent. On the debate side, okay, we've got 10 Coolidge coins here. These go to top speakers. So setting aside wins and losses for a second, now where do the speaker points fall out? And we're looking at just the prelim rounds. Okay, so over the course of 4 prelim rounds, we're just looking at speaker points. Now, does that get us anything different or interesting? Well, 10th place, Gabriel Zylstra for your Coolidge coin. All right. 9th place, Brett Banks. Come on up, Brett, if you're here. All right. 8th place, Garrett White. Garrett here. 7th place, Caleb Brown. 6th place, Danielle Miller. 5th place, Alina Rodriguez. 4th place, Patrick McDonald. 3rd place, place, Anna Say. Second place, Jay Kang. In first place, Hannah Kavanaugh. Okay. Okay, how about everybody? Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations. Okay. Coolidge Cup Octo finalists. So this, you can do a little bit of a translation. That's like places 9 through 16, but all Octo finalists equally here. Octo finalists, come up for your. It's the notebooks. Okay. Yes. Octo finalists: Paul Wooler, Victoria Campbell, Destiny Hale, Deidre Hall, Luke Carlson, Jay Kane, Sophia Zing, Alina Rodriguez. Come on up. Somebody taking photos? Okay. So that was octo finalists. Moving on to quarterfinalists. Receiving a cash prize of $500 each and a Coolidge Cup quarterfinalist trophy. Dylan Long, Charlotte Stokes, Anna Say, Tyler Seaman. Come on up.
Judge Anne Marie Hall, I think you are seated in the photographer seat. Yeah, you are. No, I mean, can you be our photographer? Thank you.
Yeah, Mom!
Coolidge Cup semifinalists receiving a cash prize of $1,000 each and a Coolidge Cup semifinalist trophy. Joshua Wales, Tristan Rampersoft. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, Coolidge Cup runner-up. Receiving a cash prize of $4,000 and a Coolidge Cup runner-up trophy. Second place, Danielle Miller. McDonald. Okay, there's one more bit here. I'd like to end the award ceremony by announcing the 2022 inductees into the Coolidge Foundation's Honor Society for Speech and Debate, which is the 1890 Society. The name 1890 Society is a reference to young Calvin Coolidge's first public speech, which he delivered on May 23rd, 1890 at the Black River Academy commencement ceremony, his high school graduation. Bless you. The topic of the speech was oratory in history, and it was received very positively by the audience and Coolidge's teachers, and it was even praised in the regional newspaper. The name for the society is obviously fitting for at least 3 reasons. One, that 1890 speech was an important moment in Coolidge's own growth as a public speaker, I think, as Dr. Both described to us, explained to us the other day. Number 2, it was delivered at a high school commencement, which is about the same age and stage of life that our student debaters are at here today. And thirdly, the speech itself was about the value and importance of oratory. So, membership in the 1890 Society is a selective honor. It is for graduating seniors who have graduated high school and who have demonstrated significant achievement in speech or debate, as well as exceptional interest or involvement in the Coolidge debate program in connection with the Coolidge Foundation. This is one of the many ways in which we hope to stay connected with them as alumni as they move on in life, wherever their journey takes them. Any of the students that I call out who are present, you can come up to the stage afterwards. We also have a few more inductees who will be in this list who now are not present here right now, and they simply weren't competing in this tournament or something like that. And we will notify and announce their achievement individually in an upcoming issue of our newsletter, which is called News from the Notch. I think you should all subscribe to. So here we go. This year's, we should do this with the one clap here. This year's inductees: Maggie Von Cannon, Ryan Clark, Chloe Peters, Patrick McDonald, Ileana Martin, Sam Bourne, Luke Carlson, Luke Pollock, Josie Seedham, Joshua Wales, Nathaniel Kulsek, Daniel Miller, and 2 extra special ones. These are retrospectives from last year's. They actually graduated in 2021, but we want to get them in here because they are excellent and super helpful and special to us as well. Justin Marwad and Laura Lee Godfrey. Now, on a closing note, I just want to say it's been a real pleasure to interact and engage with so many young, talented, hardworking individuals. I'm amazed by all the work that goes into the preparation of these speeches and the research and the hard and clever thinking. So many persuasive arguments against such a challenging resolution as this one. This is not easy by any stretch. So you've been great. So congratulations to you all, and thank you. If you like this tournament, tell your speech and debate coaches and friends. Look for announcements about next year's Coolidge Cup qualifiers. We already have one Coolidge Cup qualifier scheduled on Constitution Day on Saturday, September 17th, way up in Sun Valley, Idaho, so maybe not within reach of all of you, but if you have some Idaho connections, let us know. And there will be many more Coolidge Cup qualifier events to come, so more details on those, that tournament and other tournaments will be forthcoming. We hope to see you again next year. Thank you. Be well.